Okay. Good morning, everyone. We welcome our PTAC clients and others who are joining us today for this virtual PTAC outreach. And the subject today is small dollar acquisitions, which include the government purchasing card and request for quotations, all of which fall under the simplified acquisition threshold. I'm Chuck Spence. I'm the director of the Procurement Technical Assistance Center for the state of Utah. And today we are pleased to have as our presenters Marianne Flinders and Francine Bielik, who are both members of the PTAC team. Marianne is PTAC's regional manager for Davis, Weber, and Morgan County. Marianne has had extensive procurement experience in both the public and private sectors, including time with Hill Air Force Base, the Bureau of Reclamation, Department of Interior, L3 Communications, and now this is her second stint with PTAC. Francine Bielik is a senior consultant with LSI, and she joined LSI last March of 2020 after a number of years with Hill Air Force Base. Speaking of which, she has close to 40 years of government service, most of that with Hill Air Force Base in the contracting directorate, and was a warranted contracting officer for 23 years. So as you can see, we have two individuals who are highly trained, highly skilled in government and federal procurement. So without further ado, we'll turn the time over to Marianne Flinders. Marianne?
There we go. I had to unmute. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome everyone here today. As Chuck said, we're going to discuss today some information on small dollar acquisitions. We're going to talk about the government purchasing card, and we're also going to talk about small dollar acquisitions in general, and then we'll focus a little bit on requests for quotations. Next slide. As Chuck mentioned today, we're going to talk a little bit, first of all, about PTAC, but also, as he mentioned, we have Francine Bielik, who will do a presentation for us on the government purchasing card. And then I will speak about small dollar acquisitions and requests for quotation. We'll talk about different areas in small dollar acquisitions. And as I mentioned, we'll focus on RFQs. And we're asking that you hold your questions. You can actually submit your questions during the presentation, but we're asking that you wait for your responses until the end of both presentations. At that time, we will respond to all questions. Next slide. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about PTAC this morning. Chuck gave a good introduction. I'll tell you a little bit more about PTAC. PTAC stands for the Procurement Technical Assistance Center. It's actually a national program. PTACs are funded in all states, and basically they're funded through cooperative agreements with the Defense Logistics Agency, or DLA. And in our state, we also are funded through the Governor's Office of Economic Development. And we provide free services to Utah businesses. And we also have a teammate, which Chuck mentioned, Logistics Specialties, or LSI, supports PTAC as a teammate. So when you're working with PTAC, you may work with us, or you may also work with some of our LSI teammates. PTAC in our state is a statewide program. We have support all the different counties in the state, as you can see there. Next slide. And our mission is to help businesses successfully compete in the government marketplace by providing knowledgeable and outstanding customer service. Next slide. We provide that outstanding customer services through the free services that we provide. We do individualized counseling. We do things like bid proposal assistance, networking facilitation. Maybe you want to meet someone at Hill Air Force Base and you need help in locating them, that type of thing. We can try and help you with that. We can help you facilitate meetings. We can help you nowadays, where a lot of things are done by webinars and by telephone calls, we can give you telephone numbers, email addresses, and things like that to help you network with the organizations you're interested in. We also have a bid match program to help you find opportunities company. And then each day we search several different databases to see if there's a match with the profile we have set up for you. And if so, you'll receive an email from us with the different bid opportunities that are out there. We can help you develop marketing strategy. One of the important questions you always have to ask is, do they buy what I sell? Because if they don't, then you're wasting your time in going to visit with them, and you're also wasting their time. So it's important to develop a marketing strategy. We also can help you acquire information on historical buys, what the government's bought in the past, you know, who's provided the item in the past, what price was paid, that type of thing. We can also provide specifications and standards and procurement histories. A lot of those deal with information that manufacturers would want to see. We can also help you develop a strong capability statement. We also do a lot of training and education, such as the webinar that we're on today. We also do a lot of different workshops and conferences. We just did one on cybersecurity. I'm sure we'll see more to come on that. Do things like grow your business with government contract webinars. And we also, on October 15th, have our annual PTAC Procurement Opportunities presentation webinar coming up. Generally, this is our big annual PTAC symposium, but with the pandemic, we are doing a webinar this year. This will give you an opportunity to hear from government agencies and large contractors that will be speaking about their upcoming opportunities. So we will be sending out more information on that webinar, but keep your eyes open for that one, because that'll be a good one for you to be able to hear what's coming up in the future. We can also help you register for different systems that the government requires you to be in order to do business with them. You always need a DUNS number. You need to be registered in the system for award management. You need a cage code. We can help you with those things. And one little note I wanted to mention is the DUNS number is actually changing to a unique entity identifier in December of this year. For the time being, you still need a DUNS number, but there will be a switch coming at the end of the year. And then I just listed a few agency examples that we've provided assistance on and we've helped with. You can see GSA, DOD, DLA, Department of Interior, and so on. Next slide. And so I just wanted to give you a brief look at, I mentioned that we do provide support throughout the state. So I wanted to give you a brief look at the offices, where they're located, and the counties that those offices support. So there you have the name of the individual, the region manager for PTAC that is in the office, and you also have their email address. I believe these slides will be made available to you after the webinar, so you'll be able to get this information at that time, and then you have the contact information for the person in your area. Next slide. So now I'd like to turn the time over to Francine Bielick, and she will tell us about government purchasing cards. Francine?
Thanks, Marianne. Thanks, Chuck, for the introduction, and thank you all for attending today. I'm going to be discussing the Government Purchase Card, GPC program, also known as the GSA Smart Pay program. Next slide, please. So a quick overview of the GPC. The GPC card, the Government Purchase Card program, also known as the GSA Smart Pay program, provides charged cards to agencies and departments throughout the U.S. government, including Department of Defense, Veterans Administration, Department of Justice, Department of Interior, Health and Human Services, Department of Agriculture, Department of Homeland Security, the Postal Service, Department of Transportation, the Department of Commerce, and also state and local governments issue similar cards to their officials. Next slide. So the GPC purpose, the program, it provides a simplified, streamlined method of purchasing and paying for supplies, services, and construction projects under the micro purchase threshold. The GPC purchase, they account for billions of dollars in contracting, and they are a critical part of the government's acquisition process. It's the preferred method of procurement for essential supplies, equipment, and non-personal services. It has a huge impact in government purchasing. Next slide, please. So there's many benefits of the GPC card. It provides on-the-spot purchasing, payment, and receiving authority for individuals other than contracting or purchasing officers. So many employees at these agencies have GPC cards. In fact, Hill Air Force Base, there is 700 GPC card holders out there at this time. GPC benefits: it reduces procurement costs. It replaces paper-based, time-consuming purchase orders. It's accepted worldwide. Vendors are paid quickly for their supplies and services they provide. It makes it much easier for small stores and companies to do business with the government. There is no complicated bidding process, and it increases flexibility and rapid delivery of low-dollar mission-related supplies and services. Next slide. So GPC has thresholds. GPC card holders are authorized to make purchases up to the micro purchase threshold. Open market items, and what open market items are usually commercially available off-the-shelf items. They're not on a GSA schedule, something you can just pick up at the store basically. So for these type of items, it's $10,000 for supplies. It's $2,500 for services. And once you cross that $2,500 threshold, then the Service Contract Act applies. That's why it's limited to that dollar amount. And for construction is $2,000, and the same, the Davis-Bacon Act applies once you cross that $2,000 threshold. Next slide. So card holders are authorized to make purchases up to $25,000 under a contract schedule. So some of these examples would be an indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract, IDIQ, where the basis of payment in the contract is listed as the GPC card. A blanket purchase agreement, a BPA, and where the same payment is listed as the GPC card. And on GSA Advantage, so GSA scheduled contracts, they can award up to $25,000. Contracting officers can purchase up to the simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000 under a contract schedule. Purchases exceeding the micro purchase threshold and the SAT are reserved exclusively for small businesses. Next slide. Placing a GPC order, there are two types of transactions that can be made when making an order. Card present, this is where the card holder goes to the store, physically chooses the item they want to purchase and makes the purchase there. Card not present transactions, these are usually done over the phone or online, but please note if you do have one of these orders, include the shipping costs in the cost of the item. It should be free on board, FOB destination. And taxes, DOD and other federal agencies are exempt from paying federal taxes. Next slide, please. So the card holder, they are required to identify the supply or service that best satisfies the government's needs, weighing factors, both price and non-price factors. So for example, if there is an item that is urgently needed by the government, they may be willing to pay a higher price for this, and they can do that as long as all the vendors bidding know this. GPC card holders need to perform basic comparison shopping. They can do this by comparing prices offered by other vendors, or soliciting and receiving 3 quotes for each purchase. It's not required that they do this, but it is the preferred method to ensure price is fair and reasonable. They're also required to rotate vendors. So this is monitored. Their accounts are inspected, and if it's found that they're not rotating vendors as required by FAR Part 13, their cards can be suspended. Next slide, please. So GPC vendor payments. When a GPC purchase is made, the vendor providing the goods or services is paid by the charge card contractor. The government agency then reimburses the charge card contractor in accordance with the terms and conditions of the GSA Smart Pay Master Contracts and the Prompt Payment Act. So the time frame for you as a vendor when you receive a GSA award is you're usually paid within 2 to 3 days of shipment of the order. And as you can see below, the Prompt Payment Act, bills are to be paid within 30 days after receipt of acceptance of material services or after receipt of a proper invoice, whichever later. And when the payments are late, or if they're late, interest is automatically paid. Next slide, please. So I tried to put together some tips to help businesses win government GPC orders. So just know that government cardholders, they're required to rotate their vendors, and they're required to compare prices offered by other vendors for the same or similar item or service. This could be your chance to win GPC business. Some of the tips that you want to ensure that can help you win business is a website. So one of the first things cardholders will often do is go online and search for local companies to purchase from. So ensure you have a professional looking website that highlights what your product's skills are for your company. And also include the SmartPay logo on your site and your marketing materials. This makes it clear to cardholders that your company is willing to process GPC purchases. Next slide. It's hard at this time because of the pandemic, but when possible, develop professional relationships, attend networking events and information sessions, attend traditional trade shows and government expo events, network and try to meet the decision makers and provide your capability statement and business card to them. Try building a relationship with these people because the decision makers, they're the key to winning awards. As Marianne spoke about earlier, a capability statement. Develop a government-focused capability statement that is direct and very specific to the agency needs you would like to do business with, and clearly state how you can fulfill those needs. Tailor your statement to each federal organization you're trying to reach. Don't just use a generic statement. Use your PTAC team and have them help you build a good, strong statement. Next slide. Again, this might be difficult at this time, but when possible, introduce yourself to cardholders. Some agencies, this will be easier to do than others, but if it's possible to locate cardholders, be sure to introduce yourself. Take the time to visit them personally, introduce your business, and work to understand their needs. Remember, most cardholders prefer to do business with companies they know and trust. If the cardholder does not know about your business, that they're not going to be able to award to you. Another tip is make sure that you accept credit cards. It's important that your business accept credit cards in order to be able to process a micro purchase. If your business usually runs through a third party, such as PayPal, the government may consider this a high-risk expenditure, and they'll be less likely to seek you out. Again, add the SmartPay logo to your credit that you'll take on your credit card. Next slide. Distinguish yourself. Provide exceptional service and value. Should you land a GPC buy, ensure your performance is professional and desirable so that your company will be remembered for the next rotation when an opportunity for the same or similar requirement arises. Do them such a good job that they will seek you out for the next time. Also, establish a GSA schedule if it's a viable option. Your PTAC regional manager could help you with this. Because becoming a GSA schedule contractor, it can be highly profitable for a company. It pre-qualifies you for most government work you pursue, including competitive bids. But please note, you need to be prepared to put in the time and effort required for this process because it can be a long one. Next slide. Consider joining a trade group, one that provides information and services to small businesses seeking out government contracts, such as the American Small Business Chamber of Commerce or the American Small Business Coalition. These can be great networking opportunities for small companies. System for award management. It's not necessary to be registered in SAM for a GPC award, but sometimes cardholders will reach out and search SAM for companies to purchase from. So registering with SAM makes your business visible and acceptable to every civilian and military federal agency out there who would otherwise not be aware of what your business has to offer. Next slide. So here's some resources that can help you find and win government contracts. First of all, your Procurement Technical Assistance Center. If you're not a member, join one. They help Utah small businesses find, bid, and win procurement opportunities of federal, state, and local government entities. They provide training and help on all levels. So they're a very good resource for small business. A small business specialist. Federal agencies have designated people which act as advocates on behalf of small business with government contracting officers. So Mary Ann gave me this tip and I thought it was great, but the Georgia Tech Procurement Assistance Center website, as you can see the link, section 3, under knowing the right people, they have a long list of small business specialists for most of the different agencies. So that would be a really great place to go and look where you can contact these small business specialists. And small business specialists with the Air Force, they have a direct relationship with major commands and bases throughout the company, and they possess the expertise to help your company identify and respond to every type of procurement opportunity the Air Force offers you. And you can also see that link listed there. Those are two very good links that you might want to click through, look at, and see the information they have to offer. Next slide. So increasing opportunities for small businesses in federal contracting, it is a top priority. The Office of Management and Budget, along with the Small Business Administration, are working to improve access for small businesses to the federal market and boost communications about federal business opportunities. It's really important to get information out to the small businesses and help them win these contracts. Next slide. So in closing, remember, people ultimately make the buying decision. Finding the right people, understanding their needs, and explaining to them clearly how you can help fulfill those needs is essential to winning contracts. Thank you for your time. I'm going to turn it back over to Mary Ann. Thanks for listening. Mary Ann?
Yes, I'm making sure I'm not muted here. It looks like I'm not. Okay. Thank you, Francine. Great job. That was some very interesting information on GPC cards. And so I'm glad that you were able to present that to us today. So now we'll move along and we'll talk about small dollar acquisitions and request for quotations. And again, please hold your questions till the end of the discussion. Next slide. So first of all, when you're preparing to work with federal government solicitations, there are some things to know when you're starting out. First of all, it's very good to define what you do. I get a lot of calls from companies that see that we're a PTAC and we provide assistance, and they call me and say, I'm not sure what I want to do, but I have an idea, or I think this is something that would work. What you need to do is really create a business plan. You need to decide what you want to do. You need to put out some goals and some timelines that you're going to meet. And you need to give yourself a roadmap through that business plan of which direction you're going to head before you actually get involved in government contracting. You'll want to get yourself established with a business plan. Business plan will also be required if you need to seek financing. So that's a good way to define what you do. Next, for government contracting, you're going to want to define your North American Industry Classification Codes, or NAICS codes. Those are codes that are published by the Department of Census, and they describe all the different industries that we have and we work in. And so you'll want to make sure you understand what those codes are, because the government does use those. And also the government uses, especially Department of Defense, uses Federal Supply Group codes, FSC or FSG codes for products. And they also use product service codes or PSC codes for services. So you'll want to make sure that you can identify those for your company as well. Another thing you're going to need to do is make sure you obtain a Dun & Bradstreet number. I mentioned earlier, those are going away in December. However, for the time being, you will still need to have a DUNS number, and in the future, you'll need to have the unique entity identifier. So make sure that you obtain those first, because you can't register in the system for award management, which is a government requirement, until you have a DUNS number. So you need to register for SAM, and then you also need to obtain a contractor and government entity CAGE code, which basically identifies you as a government contractor, and that can be done as you register for SAM at the same time. So you need to obtain those things to do government business. You also want to develop a compelling small business profile and capability statement. I mentioned it earlier, and Francine also talked about it. It's very important to have a really good profile of your company and what you do to present to the government. We generally recommend you have a one-page capability statement that you can carry with you to meetings, or you can email to government agencies that displays what your company does and who you are. You also want to look into designing a company website. For a lot of these really small dollar acquisitions, the government's going to be out there looking at websites. So that is a must do if you want to participate in this arena. Also, make sure you have business cards. Another thing that has been recommended, and I've heard it mentioned in several different webinars that I've listened to, and I've heard companies talk about it, is to develop social media profiles. Facebook, LinkedIn, several other types of profiles and social media opportunities out there that you can mention your company. You can look for others that are in LinkedIn or Facebook that maybe do something similar to you. Network with them. Network with government agencies that have Facebook profiles or LinkedIn profiles. So it'll help you find some contacts as well as provide information about your own company. Also, conduct market research. You've got to find out who buys what you sell. Because if you don't, like I mentioned earlier, you're wasting your time and their time. And so before you go out to contact an agency, make sure that you don't go to someone that, if you sell banana nut bread, you don't want to go to maybe an Air Force installation that doesn't buy banana nut bread. You would want to have your research done, and you would understand that maybe the defense commissaries would buy banana nut bread, but Hill Air Force Base as an agency is probably not going to buy that product from you. So conduct your market research and find out who buys what you sell. And also you want to next move on to finding the bid opportunities, and you're going to be looking at both prime and subcontracting opportunities that will help you grow and develop your business. Next slide. So when we talk about small dollars, there are a couple of acquisition thresholds that you should understand. Francine mentioned micro purchase. That is the first one. That's the small dollar one, very small dollar one, where they're acquiring supplies or services using something called the simplified acquisition procedures. Micro purchases have different thresholds. They're $3,500 and under for most agencies, or $10,000 and under for the Department of Defense, GSA, and NASA. Those agencies have more money, so basically they have actually raised their micro purchase threshold. These micro purchases are not set aside for small business, and they're not published in beta.sam.gov. So you will not see these advertised. Occasionally, an agency will put something in beta.sam.gov, but most of the time, micro purchases will not be published in a public place like beta.sam.gov. You just won't find them there. Next slide. The next threshold is the Simplified Acquisition Threshold, or SAT, and that is basically an acquisition of supplies or services which will exceed the micro purchase thresholds we just discussed, but they don't exceed $150,000 for most agencies or $250,000 for Department of Defense. Again, Department of Defense has a deviation that allowed them to up their simplified acquisition threshold to $250,000. So you'll see a difference there. These that are above the micro purchase threshold are automatically set aside for small business, and acquisitions over 25,000 are going to be published in beta.sam.gov. Next slide. Now, I mentioned simplified acquisition procedures are used for these small dollar buys. Those are in Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR Part 13. And I just wanted to highlight a few things out of that section to let you understand. I know there's a lot of things I hear all the time. People tell me, well, I know I can't get into those buys because they only award to their friends, or they only award to this company or that company. So I pulled a few things out of the FAR that I just wanted to mention so that you know that those are rumors and there are laws and regulations. The contracting officer must not solicit quotations based on personal preference. So they can't call their buddy and say, hey, I need this, will you supply it? And also, they can't restrict solicitations to suppliers of well-known makes or brands. They can't just say, oh, there's a product that I really like, so I'm just going to keep ordering that over and over. They actually have to create a brand name justification if they do that, and that has to be published and posted in beta.sam.gov. So they have to justify why a certain brand would be better than something that someone else could provide. There's also something called brand name or equal. The government will try to use brand name or equal solicitations where you can provide the brand name, but they'll publish what they call salient characteristics about the item. And if you can provide an item that meets those salient characteristics, it does not need to be the brand name. That basically opens it up for more competition. Okay, and if the government is posting the RFQ to beta.sam.gov, what the FAR basically says is maximum practicable competition can generally be obtained by soliciting quotes or offers from within the local trade area. So basically what they're saying there is you don't need to have an extensive search to fulfill the needs of these small dollar buys. You can go within your local trade area and you can find your suppliers there. So that's why this is important for you to understand more about these small dollar procedures and the buys so that you can be part of those. Another part of the FAR basically says consider solicitation of at least 3 sources to promote competition. And whenever practicable, request quotes or offers from 2 sources that weren't included in the previous solicitation. So in other words, Francine mentioned government's effort to rotate the list so they don't keep going back to the same suppliers over and over and over. It gives others an opportunity to actually participate in the competition for these small dollars. The government, however, does also have a condition where they may solicit from one source if only one source is reasonably available. So the government can go out on some of these small dollars and say, well, I'm going to buy this brand because it's going to take me longer to find someone else that provides it or provides this product that I need. And as long as they can justify the price as being fair and reasonable, they can actually solicit from just one source. Next slide. So some of the solicitation methods that they use for these types of procurements, they use generally on micro purchases, it will be an oral solicitation. They very rarely would use a request for quotation because they take longer, it's more effort to put it together. It's just easier on if they need a couple of widgets to call 3 companies, get bids, and then make an award. So you generally won't see them issue an RFQ at that dollar level. However, up to the simplified acquisition threshold, which you remember is 150,000 or 250,000, depending on who you're working with, they will do a request for quotation or an invitation for bid. An oral solicitation is still used on those that are over the micro purchase threshold that go up to $25,000. They'll still follow that same format again because these are simplified smaller dollars. And again, they could issue an RFQ for that level, but a lot of times they will do an oral solicitation. Invitations for bid, those are going to be very non-complex. They don't anticipate any communication with the government. They put out a buy for something, they announce it, and they expect it to be very clear-cut and easy for those kinds of requirements when they do that kind of a solicitation. So they do use IFBs and RFQs for those types of solicitations. Next slide. So to look a little closer at the solicitation methods, when they use an oral solicitation, generally what they do is call a vendor. They'll get 3 vendors, they'll call them, they'll provide what their requirement is, they'll ask for price and delivery, and that's it. When you use a request for quotation, if it's over $25,000, if the acquisition is estimated to be over that amount, they will post it on beta.sam.gov. They will use these when it's under the simplified acquisition threshold. Generally in an RFQ, they'll request things like pricing, delivery, payment terms, and any other terms and conditions that are applicable to the requirement. Vendors will respond to the RFQ with a quote. And I wanted you to understand that quotes aren't offers, and they can't be accepted to form an actual binding contract. They are just that, a quote. The government may be going out and requesting a quote because they're looking for estimated costs. They're trying to develop their costs, or they're looking at delivery times to see what it would take to get this item. So they're not a binding contract. The government's just asking you for a quote, and they're asking you for some very basic information to determine, what their buy is going to cost them, or if they're going to go through with the buy and that type of a thing. And then after a request for quote, after the government receives your quote, then the government's offer back to you as a purchase order. And that is basically not a contract either. It doesn't become a contract until the supplier accepts the offer by proceeding with work to the point where substantial performance has occurred, or by written acceptance. And as you can see, I've said preferred there. I was reading a case the other day about purchase orders, and a contractor had actually decided that they wouldn't sign. They would just go ahead and go with the contract method where they have substantial performance and they were ready to deliver, and they called the government on some questions they had with delivery, and the government said, oh, we canceled that. We're not going to buy that now. We changed our mind. And so this poor contractor protested and did not win because there was no binding agreement. There was no written agreement or acceptance there. So everything he'd done to, perform and provide to the government, he lost out on. So it's always recommended that you do the written acceptance, because then that kind of protects you. If the government does change their mind and they withdraw, amend, or cancel by written notice anytime before acceptance occurs, you will be paid for the cost of your supplies and things like that if you have a written acceptance by the government. If you don't, then you're just out. So, and you can reference that at FAR 13.004C. Invitation for bids are another solicitation method that's used, or IFBs. Those again are going to be posted on beta.sam.gov if they're over $25,000. And these are going to be sealed bids, competitive bids, and these will have a public bid opening. These are going to have a location, a date, a time specified, and a bid box where people will come to the bid opening, and they'll open the bid box and they will actually read off the pricing and who bid. And price on these is key. As I mentioned earlier on IFBs, the government requirements on these are clearly defined and accurately described, so there are no questions. So basically, the government calls out who was bid and the price they bid, and they award to the lowest bidder on those, and that's how those work. Next slide. How does the government locate suppliers? So basically, this slide is telling you how the government locates suppliers, not how you locate them. We'll do a slide on that next. But the government is required to conduct market research. Per FAR 10.001, they have to conduct market research appropriate to the circumstances. So the more complex, the more dollar value that your acquisition has, the more market research that will be conducted. If it's a small dollar effort, they will do less market research, but they will still do market research. And so when I mentioned 3 bids, that's part of their market research. They're going out to industry and saying, hey, I need this item. What do you want to, what are you going to charge me for it? And what's the delivery terms, that type of thing. The government's still conducting market research prior to their actual award. So on these micro purchases, under micro purchase thresholds, the government, in order to find vendors, will look at historical information. Who provided it in the past? What list did they have in the past of vendors that could actually supply this? They'll conduct a lot of internet searches. They will go out there and put in keywords and terms that they're looking for to find people that can fulfill their needs. They'll also look at the Small Business Administration's Dynamic Small Business Search, or DSBS tool. And basically, all of you, if you're registered in the system for award management, will have a DSBS profile. Some people don't realize that, but when you register for SAM, SBA takes part of your information out of your SAM profile and puts it into the Dynamic Small Business Search tool. And so you do have a profile out there. And so the government does search those. They can go in and search by keywords. They can search by NAICS codes, by FSC codes, by your socioeconomic status. And so the government will use that tool to look for vendors. So you want to make sure that your dynamic small business search information is adequate and you're happy with what it says. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. The government will also look at the SAM system to find vendors. They can look at SAM, and again, they can run some searches in there and find a list of vendors that they may be interested in approaching about supplying their products under micro purchases. And again, these are not small business set-asides. Under micro purchases, anybody can provide the product to the government. So over the micro purchase threshold up to the simplified acquisition threshold, or SAT, they use a similar process to find suppliers for those items that are above micro purchase but up to $25,000. When they get over $25,000 all the way up to the simplified acquisition threshold, they will publish a request for information or a sources sought synopsis in beta.sam.gov. The difference between the two, usually a request for information is posted first and earlier. An RFI goes out and basically says, hey, contractor, I have this requirement, and this is what we're looking at. This is what we have so far. What feedback can you give me to help me specify and develop my requirement further? So the government will then take the feedback from contractors. Like I mentioned, this is all still part of market research. They take the information, they continue to develop their requirement, and then it could be months later, they will publish a sources sought synopsis, and they will be saying, hey, contractor, we have our requirement defined now. We know what we're looking for. This is what we're going to buy. Who can support my requirement? And so then they're looking for you to respond back to them to tell them, you know, if you can actually support the requirement as it is now. That's usually, like I say, the second notification that they will publish. The government will also locate suppliers. Again, for this threshold, they'll look at the Dynamic Small Business Search tool again, review SAM again, and at this threshold, these are automatically set aside for small business programs. However, if the government receives information back from the companies as they're doing their market research, and they cannot find 2 or more small businesses that can meet their requirements, then they can dissolve the set aside and go out to full and open competition. Next slide. So then, as a contractor, we just looked at how the government actually finds suppliers. Now, how do you, as a contractor, find these opportunities, these small dollar opportunities, especially the ones under $25,000 because they're not published anywhere? So Francine mentioned a lot of really good tips, and some of mine are, you know, the same or similar to hers, but I'll mention them again because they say that repetition is a good way to learn, so I will repeat. Have a good, searchable, updated website. That is so important. As I mentioned earlier too, the government is able to look at local suppliers for these small dollar bids. So they will do that. So make sure that your website is updated, current, everything on there works, your links all work, and that you don't make it too difficult for the government to find the information. They don't want to have to click on several links to get to their answer. And if they have to click on 3 or 4 links, they may be gone by then. So make sure that you have a good searchable website, updated, the links work, everything's clearly described. Put keywords on your site that appeal to your target agency. Remember, I talked earlier about knowing who buys what you sell. Well, if your target audience is Hill Air Force Base and you sell balloons, and you know that Hill Air Force Base buys balloons, maybe you want to put on the entry page into your website something about balloons, or maybe mention Hill Air Force Base, because you want to make sure that that agency, again, when they're searching for you, will pull up things that are generated from your website that they can identify with and find you. Another thing that Francine mentioned, I'll mention again, connecting with contracting officers, end users, and small business offices. And as she mentioned, it's difficult with the pandemic right now, but it's not impossible. Whenever you look at beta.sam.gov and you're looking at solicitations and you find something that sounds like maybe something you could do, maybe you can't do this, but it's in your industry, it's something that's similar or something related to your industry, on those notices, there's always a contracting officer and a contract specialist listed. So take note of those people, write their names down, take their email, take their phone number, make contact with them. You can call them, you can send them an email, you can ask them if you can send information on your company to them, and just introduce yourself in that way. Sometimes if you're looking at requirements that are on beta.sam.gov, you'll find they have a performance work statement or a statement of work when you're doing services. They will a lot of times have an end user's name on there. I've seen program managers' names and engineers' names on some of those documents. So again, look at those documents. If you find names and contacts, make use of those. Also, most agencies have small business offices. If they don't have an office, they'll have a person that is designated to be the small business representative that actually works with small business. So connect with those people as well. Sometimes agencies like Hill Air Force Base are huge, and to try and get in there and figure out who you meet with would almost be impossible. So the best entry point for you is to contact the small business office. Talk to them about what you sell and what you'd like to do, and see if they can help you facilitate meetings or contacts. Another thing, I mentioned the Small Business Dynamic Search tool that SBA has. This is the website that you can go to look at your information. I urge you all to look at your information and make sure that this provides a good description of your company. A lot of times when I previously worked at the Hill Air Force Base Small Business Office, and a lot of times we would have companies that we'd be looking at. I would help the buyers locate vendors, and we would look at the dynamic small business search profile. We'd get into some of the profiles, we'd run a list, we'd get a list of vendors, and some of the summary statements or capability statements of the company were so poor that we could not tell what the company did. And so in that case, if a buyer has a list of 30 or 40 companies, they're going to go to those that they feel like they know exactly what they do and that have a good description of what they do. So it's really important that you have a good summary of your company in that profile, because the government does use that tool. So I urge you to look at that, and if you do not like what you see there and you want to update that information, contact your PTAC representative, your region manager in your area, and they can tell you how to go in and update that information. Another thing Francine mentioned, attend industry days. Right now, we're not doing them in person, but as I mentioned, we're doing a lot of webinars. Our big procurement opportunity presentation will be online. So attend industry days online. Listen to what they have to say. Listen to the types of things they buy, and most importantly, have your pen and pencil ready, pen and paper ready, to take notes on who those contacts are. Write down their phone numbers, their names, their email addresses. Also, you can attend procurement conferences online. Like I say, not only industry days, procurement conferences, industry association events. And I mentioned earlier, looking at social media like LinkedIn. LinkedIn will have a lot of different things published and a lot of different people that are on there. And if your target is the military, there are a lot of people in the military that have profiles out there, and they work for acquisition offices. So these are all ways that you can connect with people, let them know you're out there, so that you can hopefully find out about the small dollar opportunities that are available. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit now about RFQs. What is an RFQ? An RFQ is a request for quotation. We talked about it a little bit earlier. It's used by the government to obtain information and quotations. They use it, like I say, for information. It doesn't necessarily lead to a binding contract. As we discussed earlier on a previous slide, what would lead to a binding contract? And that would be a purchase order and your acceptance of that, and written acceptance being the best case. So an RFQ is utilized on acquisitions that are under the simplified acquisition threshold. We've kind of spoken about that on previous slides. The simplified acquisition procedures apply, FAR Part 13. An RFQ may be used in circumstances where simplified acquisition procedures are not used. So on commercial items, for example, commercial item has a threshold of $700,000. They can buy commercial items on an RFQ up to that dollar threshold. So they may not use a simplified RFQ. They may still use an RFQ as the format for their acquisition, but it may be a lot more complex than a typical RFQ you would see, and not use simplified acquisition procedures just because of the dollar threshold. Generally, when you're dealing with an RFQ, you will have a bid package that will include the cover sheet, which is a standard form 18 or a standard form 1449 if you're dealing with commercial items. Next page. So now let's look a little bit at the solicitation number that can be used so you can identify what you're looking at. And you'll notice I've got an arrow there for the FA8224. That information on the solicitation number or the contract award number identifies the buying office. And in case you didn't know, for example, FA82, that's a Hill Air Force Base buying office. FA82 is always going to be something, if you see something on beta.sam.gov that begins with an FA82, you will know that is out of Hill Air Force Base. The last two numbers, the 24, actually identify the specific office. But anything you find that's FA82 is basically referring to what the military, DOD, call their DODAC, or their Department of Defense Activity Address Code. And they use those, like I say, at the Air Force Institution. They call it a DODAC. Other agencies don't call it a DODAC. It's just their buying office. And so anyway, when you're looking at a solicitation or a contract award, just understand that those first few numbers or alpha codes refer to the buying office that you're looking at. The next two numbers refer to the fiscal year that we're in. So hence, on this one, you see a 20. The next number actually identifies the solicitation type. And in this case, we're looking at an RFQ number because there's a Q in there. And then the last four numbers are the specific contract identifier. So those are specific to that contract. There won't be another contract that has that number on it. And if you look down in the left-hand side of that slide, you'll see the alpha code meanings so that you can understand what some of the other codes mean. If rather than a Q, we had an R in that solicitation number, you'd be looking at a request for proposal. If it had an I or a B, you'd be looking at an invitation for bid, a sealed bid. If there was a T in there, that would also be an RFQ, but it would be for a small dollar one that is under $25,000. And when you're looking at a Q, that would be for a regular RFQ that is under simplified acquisition threshold. Next slide. So for the format for an RFQ, the government contracting follows something called the Uniform Contract Format, which is in Part 15. It actually has 4 different parts to it and different sections under each part that are explained, as you can see on the slide. Section A is for solicitations, contract forms. The forms I mentioned, the SF-18, SF-1449, those would be considered part of Section A. Section B is your supplies and services, and so on. It goes from A to M, and basically that is the structure the government follows for their contracts. Now, when you're dealing with an RFQ, because it is below the simplified acquisition threshold, they will use a streamlined format. So you will see this structure followed. They'll follow the format of the section A, B, C, D, E, but generally they will not call out those sections, but they will still follow the same format. They'll have the solicitation contract form first. They'll have the supplies and services next. They'll have a statement of work next. So they will follow the uniform contract format. They just won't specify the sections. It won't be as formal as something you would see on a request for proposal, which is something that's over the simplified acquisition threshold. And the government may use some of the sections. They can still use some of the sections if they'd like to, that are outlined in the uniform contract format, but they may not. So just understand that an RFQ will not be as complex. You won't see all this information in there that you would see on a larger dollar acquisition. Next slide. And these are the remainder of the other sections that are in the uniform contract format. As I mentioned, they go to section M. And I'll call your attention to section L and M. L is basically in a large dollar solicitation, and also in the small. I've noticed some of the smaller solicitations will, like I say, it won't say section L, but near the end of the solicitation, they will identify any instructions or conditions or notices to offers near the end of your solicitation. Basically tells you how to put your solicitation together, if there are specific instructions, and when it has to be turned in by, your date that it's due by, and that type of thing. And then section M, on a large dollar proposal, you're going to see evaluation factors that lead to award. However, on an RFQ, per the FAR, they are not required to state the relative importance assigned to each evaluation factor and subfactor, and they're not even required to include subfactors. I have, again, seen some RFQs that will have, they won't have section M specified, but at the end of their document, their solicitation, they'll say, this will be awarded based on, and that's kind of their evaluation factors. And they may say best value, or they may say this will be awarded on lowest price technically acceptable, where the government's going to determine if you're technically acceptable first. If you are, then they look at your price and they'll award to the one that's technically acceptable that has the lowest price. So these areas in an RFQ are not going to be as extensive. You're not going to see much in there, or you may see nothing at all about evaluation factors. But if it becomes a little bit larger dollar value, there's a possibility you could see something like that in there. So just keep that in mind. Next slide. So now, I know these are hard to read. I apologize, they're pretty small. I tried to squeeze them down so at least you could get an idea of what an RFQ form looks like. The front page that you're going to see, as I mentioned, section A, you'll have the standard form 18 or request for quotation, or you'll have the SF 1449, which is for written solicitations for commercial items. And on most of those, you'll see on the SF 1449 at the very top, they actually spell out which blocks the offer is to complete. So if you do work with a solicitation that has a 1449, it tells you complete blocks 12, 17, 23, 24, and 30. And you'll find those, most of those deal with including your unit price, your total price, it could be your net payment terms, and then generally they have you sign your title, your name, and information about your company at the bottom. On the standard Form 18, similar process. At the bottom of the page, under, you can probably read where it says discount FOB prompt payment. Underneath that, you'll see the information they're asking for from contractors. They're asking you to provide your name and address of the quoter, and then they ask you to sign it, and then they ask for the title of the person who's signing. And so that's pretty simple. Both of those are pretty simple formats for you to complete when you are responding to an RFQ. Next page. So this is an actual RFQ that I pulled off of beta.sam.gov for Hill Air Force Base. It's a very simple RFQ, but I just wanted you to see the kind of information that an RFQ may be looking for when one is out there. So of course, we just looked at the cover page. This one happens to be purchased for a commercial item. So this would have had an SF 1449 on it. You would complete those blocks that are mentioned on the SF 1449. Then you would go to this page and you would actually be looking at the RFQ. Read the instructions at the top of the RFQ. They're telling you the solicitation number, that it's an RFQ. In this instance, they're looking for a brand name set aside. They give you the NAICS code that they're buying under. Remember, I said it's important to identify your NAICS codes. And they're telling you that they'll make a single award as a result of evaluation of quotes. So that's, you know, that's their section M. Basically, they're saying they're going to evaluate quotes and they'll make an award. They describe to you the items. This would be similar to section B, as we mentioned. The items that you're buying there, they're going to buy some adhesive film. They're looking for 1,500 square feet. They want delivery to be 150 days after receipt of order. They're asking you to include your unit price. What is your price per foot there? And then they're asking you to include the total price for all feet, 1,500 square feet, up above and down below. They tell you, again, when the required delivery is, and then they're going to tell you they want the place of delivery to be hill or for space. Then they're going to ask you some questions there, and you need to make sure you respond to those. Are you registered in SAM? What is your DUNS number? Do you have a cage code number, your tax ID number, and what your discount terms are? Next page. And continuing on with the second page of this RFQ, they're telling you who your contact is. And this would be similar to what we were talking about, the sections on the other page, your instructions to offer. They're asking you to submit questions to the contracting officer, and here is who he is. They're telling you when questions can be submitted by. And then they're telling you have to be registered in SAM to be considered for an award. So again, you need to make sure you register in these databases for government contracting, or you can't even bid or be considered for an award. And there is an exception, like Francine said, you don't have to be registered in SAM to do government purchasing card buys. But a lot of contractors do register in SAM because hopefully, as they evolve, they get more into government purchasing cards, then they can start getting involved in larger dollar procurements, and they will want to be registered in SAM to bid on those. Again, some more instructions. They're telling you to send your quote in to the contracting officer by 2 p.m. On the 8th of March, 2019. So there are your instructions to offers right there. They do have a few provisions and clauses that are applicable to this RFQ. They've listed those there. Those are not listed in full text. If you want to see them in full text, you can go search for, I think it's acquisition.gov is where the FAR is posted. You can go out and look at those in full text if you'd like to. And then at the bottom of this RFQ, they're telling you that in no manner does this RFQ obligate the government to award a contract. So we mentioned that about making sure that if you get a purchase order from the government as a result of responding to an RFQ, that you do a written acceptance, because the government can cancel or withdraw or modify. Just because you respond to an RFQ doesn't make the government, it does not require them to have to award a contract. Like I say, they can be using the RFQ information for many things. They can be using it to determine pricing. They can be using it to determine delivery. They can be using it to determine who's out there that could meet their requirements. So basically, that's an RFQ. That's a very simple one, but that is what you will see on an RFQ. You'll be filling out the SF-18 or 1449, the cover page. Then you'll just have a few simple things within the text of that RFQ that they will be looking for you to complete and provide back to them. Next slide. So when you respond to an RFQ, make sure that you read and reread the solicitation document. Even though it's simple, it's easy to forget things. I've seen contractors that have forgotten to put something on the SF-18 or the SF-1449. It's simple to do because you may not see a block that you should have responded to. So you want to make sure that you read and reread, you understand the schedules the government's looking for, understand their clauses and attachments, understand the request and how to fulfill the request. One good tip is to make a copy of the solicitation and highlight all the fill-ins. Even though you're going to respond back electronically, print out a hard copy, get a yellow highlighter, highlight every area as you read through this that requires a fill-in. And then when you go back to your document online, you'll make sure that you hit all those yellow areas that are on your solicitation that require something to be completed. Make sure you complete, again, make sure you complete all the required blocks on the SF-18 or 1449. Like I mentioned, I've seen that mistake made in the past. Provide all the information that the government's asking for and follow all the schedules in the order, time frame, and structure requested. Remember the uniform contract format. Even though it's not as formal on an RFQ, they're still following that type of format. So respond back to them in the format that they have provided. Respond appropriately, answer all the questions that they ask you. Review and understand the regulations governing the type of solicitation you respond to. In this case, FAR Part 13. You may want to look that up and look through there and just see. It's not difficult to read. It's pretty quick reading. You'll see what the regulations and laws are that deal with the simplified acquisition procedures, so you understand those better. You may want to take a minute and look through that. If you're not sure about something, when you're responding to your RFQ, ask questions. These are not as formal as an RFP where they shut off the time that you can actually ask questions or make contact. So go ahead and ask questions of the contract specialist or the contracting officer that's listed, and make sure that you understand what they're actually asking you for before you move on. Make sure your pricing is fair and competitive. The thing you don't want to do is say, oh, here's an opportunity for me. I'm going to jack up my price so I can win this government bid, and then I'm going to make some money off the government because I know they pay their bills. That's not what you want to do. If you want to be fair, the government has to justify the price as fair and reasonable. And they're going to be looking at ways to do that. They're going to look at past solicitations, past quotations and bids they've received. They have other ways that they look at fair prices. They have some formulas they use, things like that. So you're going to want to make sure that it is fair, that it's fair to the government and it's fair to you, because the government understands the contractor has to make profit and should make profit. But you're going to make sure that your price is also competitive, so you're in the ballpark to win some of these awards. Make sure that your response is well written and error-free. Have a second set of eyes review the response. You know, a lot of times we look at things over and over and over and we think it's ready to go, and I'll be darned if we don't see a mistake when we actually go through it another time. And so have a second set of eyes look through your response before you submit it, and then contact the buyer or the contracting officer to verify that they received your quote. Francine mentioned that to me, and I added it in here because that's an excellent point. A lot of times you'll submit something to the buyer, you assume they got it, but who knows? You know, systems go down. For example, Hill Air Force Base is a large installation. There are server issues, different problems up there. You may assume that your bid got in and it did not, and you may find out that someone else won an award and your price was lower and you wonder why you didn't win. And Francine actually mentioned an instance to me that she had when she was a contracting officer, where she had to deal with a protest because that very situation happened to her. So very important to verify that your quote is received. Next page. So when you respond to an RFQ, there's a few things you do want to avoid. Avoid the fact that you don't fully understand the solicitation and the regulations that are in the solicitation. You want to avoid that. You want to make sure you do a quick read on some of those clauses and you understand what the government's asking for. You want to avoid incomplete or late submission. On an RFQ, it's not as critical. You can call the buyer a lot of times and say, I'm still sending this in, and they will take your quote late. The best thing you can do is make sure that you submit on time and you get the information into them and it's not late or incomplete. And when you're bidding, especially when you're supplying a quote back on something that's of a larger dollar value, don't include a lot of fluff in your proposal, because basically, or your quotation, because basically you're going to be telling the government, I'm the bestest, I'm the quickest, I'm the fastest. Everybody tells them that. You want to put substance in as to why you're actually better and the things you've done to support that. Don't put a lot of fluff. It's not necessary. Again, I talked about pricing, unrealistic pricing. Don't do that. Watch for errors in your submission. Watch spelling. Spelling, everybody has spell check, so use it. And I'll tell you, that's not just for you guys as vendors to the government, but I saw a lot of errors in documents when I worked for Hill Air Force Base that should not have been in there. So use your spell check. And if there are evaluation factors that they've chosen to include in the RFQ, make sure you address each one of those. Next slide. So that kind of brings us to the conclusion of the presentation, both Francine's and mine. And so we both told you that we would have questions and discussions right now at this time. So Joshua, do we have any questions out there?
Yes, Marianne, we have one.
Okay.
Brian wants us to review and outline the different levels of the simplified acquisition threshold for things like commercial items, small business set aside. Just kind of reviewing the different thresholds again, I think.
Oh, okay. Well, there basically are just the two thresholds. The thresholds for micro purchases are generally $3,500 and under, or if you're with DoD, NASA, or GSA, the threshold is $10,000 and under. And under those requirements, micro purchases, they do not have small business set-asides. Those requirements will be open competition. And when you then look at the next threshold, that would be the simplified acquisition threshold, and you would have a threshold of $150,000 for most agencies, or $250,000 is the threshold for the Department of Defense. And so under those levels, you would have simplified acquisition procedures utilized, and that would be where you'd use an RFQ. Those are automatically set aside for small business, and the only way they would not be set aside for small business is if the government, when they're conducting market research, can't find 2 or more small businesses that can meet their requirement. Then they would dissolve the small business set aside, and they would issue the requirement as full and open competition. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you. Let's see. Paula wanted to point out to remember to acknowledge any amendments that come out.
Yes,
that sometimes that's missed. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Paula. That's a good thing too. Make sure if the government does amend the RFQ document that you acknowledge that you received the amendment. And so that's very important to do as well.
And then Mark asks, there's 2 terms that are used, micro purchase and purchase cards, and just wanting to understand fully the difference between the 2.
Francine, do you want to address that one? Is she muted?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute.
Okay, you're good.
Okay. So micro purchase and the GPC purchase are 2 different things. They prefer that everything under the micro purchase, which as Marianne's just stated, what the thresholds are purchased on a GPC card. Does that help?
Yes, I believe so. Excellent. And then as a reminder, these slides will be sent out to all the participants at the conclusion of this meeting. Alex asks, which of the credit card companies does the government use for most of the government purchasing cards?
Most of them are the MasterCard, but there are several different companies. GSA has contracts with several different credit card companies, but most of them will be the MasterCard.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions? I'll give a minute just in case people are entering their questions into the chat.
Okay.
It looks like that's the conclusion of the questions. I'm going to go ahead and unmute Chuck Spence to looks like we have one more question. Pete asks, if the government does not know about certain products available, how would I get the word out to them that we have a unique product that they may not be aware of?
Well, on a small dollar acquisition, those are generally not going to be things, when you're selling to the government, a lot of the products they buy have to be national stock number coded, NSN. They have to have an NSN number assigned to them. so they can keep them in inventory and rebuy. But when you have a brand new item like that you're introducing to the government, if you're introducing something under the micro purchase threshold that can be bought with a government purchasing card, the best thing you can do is the things that Francine and I mentioned. Have a good website, make connections with the small business offices, tell them about your product. You know, basically, if you see something on beta.sam.gov that's not your product but similar, or it's in your industry, look and see who the buyer listed is and contact them and see if you can talk to them about your product, and see if you can find out how their agency does small dollar purchases. And a lot of times too, if you can get to the person that manages the government purchasing card program, you can send them information on what your product is, and they can actually send it out to their GPC card holders. Like at Hill Air Force Base, there are so many card holders now that they don't keep a list to send out to vendors. They used to do that. They don't do it any longer because the card holders change so frequently, and there are different situations that arise with cards. So they don't give you a list of cards. But for example, if you work with PTAC, there's an individual at Hill that we can send your information to and request that he put it in their little monthly publication to card holders, or that he just distribute the information out. So that would be one way.
Excellent. Pam asks, does it cost money to be a government purchasing card vendor?
It does not.
Excellent. Rachel asks, do you have any suggestions for networking with cardholders under these COVID-19 restrictions?
Do you want to answer that, Francine? I think it's just what we talked about, the same thing, that the methods that we said in our slides.
Yeah, and it's like Marianne said, that even though you may not be able to personally meet with them, you can attend the webinars, you can, you know, pick up the phone and make phone calls to them and introduce yourself that way, or any time you can attend a webinar or a virtual trade show or anything, then that's an opportunity to meet people and make phone calls, emails, whatever you can to contact with these people.
Yep, and a lot of the small business representatives a lot of times attend their webinars and things for agencies. And so as I mentioned earlier, that's a really good entry point for introducing your company to the government at a certain agency. Try and locate the small business people and contact them.
And in my slides, I did list that government tech PTAC listing that Marianne pointed out to me. And there are small business specialists listed on that for almost every federal agency. So start there, look, you know, get some names and contact information there also. And also your Air Force Small Business Office. They're a great resource.
Excellent. That appears to be the conclusion of the question and answers.
Okay, I'll just wrap up real quick then, Joshua, before Chuck comes back on. That in conclusion, we talked today about the government purchasing card, about small dollar acquisitions and RFQs, specifically spoke about working with federal government solicitations, solicitation methods, what an RFQ is. And basically, we hope we gave you some good information today that you can take with you. And I know some of it was repetitive, but again, that's the best way to learn. So hopefully you've learned at least one thing today, and then I think we've accomplished our mission. So thank you. Chuck?
Marianne, thank you. Francine, to the both of you, an excellent job. This is very thorough, very complete. And one of the reasons we wanted to do an outreach on these on this topic is because for small businesses, this is probably the majority of the solicitations that you will be responding to. Is under the simplified acquisition threshold. And Marianne and Francine has well explained the ins and outs of it to you. So I think your time was well spent listening to the both of them today. So we'd like to thank them with virtual applause. So thank you, Marianne and Francine. Also to our clients, to those in attendance today, please know that we have a number of other PTAC outreaches coming up in the month of September. So go to our website to see a list of those. Again, that website is business.utah.gov/PTAC, and it will be on our website under events. As mentioned earlier, again, our big event is coming up on October 15th. A few weeks ago, we sent out the save the date to our clients. And a second flyer will be coming up probably in the next 2 to 3 weeks that we will send out. And that information will also be on our website. So be looking for that. So at the conclusion, again, we thank you for your time. We thank you for participating and asking some really great questions. Again, to Marianne Flinders and to Francine Bielik, we thank you for your time and effort in preparing for this. So we'll conclude now, and thank you for attending.
Thank you.